Okay, thank you for joining us. I am Rachael Woody, and I work with Society of American Archivists Committee on Public Awareness. And for today, we are doing an Archival Innovator interview. And I am joined by a founder of an organization that is just amazing, and I'm really excited to have a conversation with him. Brian, would you please introduce yourself and your organization?
Hi, sure, a pleasure. Thank you for having us, Rachel. I'm Brian Pope. I'm the founder and executive director of Arck Project, which is a 501c, a nonprofit that I started to generate a citizen science approach to digital cultural heritage preservation, specifically using techniques like LiDAR and photogrammetry.
So for Arck Project, and I know you got into just a little bit of this, but I would love for you to describe specifically the role that Arck Project plays in preserving cultural heritage. How do you do it? I know there's a lot to it, and so, I mean, please feel free to share and describe as you see fit.
I think that our primary role, as we've defined it since the founding of the organization, is disruptor. Just difficult, obnoxious, unorthodox. We try to be literally, deliberately, all kidding aside, a kind of disruptor in the sense that at the time that I founded Arck Project, I got very much a sense that there are inadvertent gatekeeper paradigms at play in how cultural heritage is archived, how it's accessed, and who gets to be a player in archiving, in deciding what gets archived. And that hit me on a personal level because I guess I'm a person who tends not to really accept any barrier or boundary that I come across. And I myself have, monolithic tastes. I love monolithic architecture and so on, but I cannot and never have accepted the idea that that is all of heritage. Heritage is the intimate. Heritage is how you personally define it. And I saw a niche that needed to be filled there in terms of how we define cultural heritage, how we archive it, and who gets to decide how that heritage is archived and what resources can be brought to bear for it, and whether that is considered valid science. And so that's actually one of the things that my organization uses as its rallying call, which is the ability to generate what is casually referred to as citizen science. We absolutely believe that archiving cultural heritage can be democratized, and that citizens, the average person, is completely capable of both deciding and executing a cultural archive for themselves and for their culture.
I love that you described yourself as a disruptor, and I very much view it as like a badge of honor that you have definitely earned.
Thank you.
And just wanted to note that this series is called Archival Innovators, and I have found in my experiences that you don't have innovation unless you are disrupting the status quo. So
Agreed.
yeah.
Agreed. We actually employ a full-time archivist, Michael Conyers. I think you're acquainted with him. And he actually inadvertently gave me one of the greatest compliments I've been given since we've been engaging in our project. He called me, and you may want to believe this, I don't know, a shit disturber. And I wear that badge with honor and pride. I think we all do at Arck Project. And it's not that the archival community is in any way lacking the cultural heritage community. There are some fantastic people that have given their life's work for this, right? But any organization, any institution, any workflow can almost always benefit, I think, from somebody from the outside saying, wait a minute, let's shake this up a little bit. Let's rethink this, for better or worse.
Mostly for better is what I'm seeing on this
Thank you.
list.
You're
Mhm.
very gracious. Thank you.
So while we're still on your origin story, so to
Ooh,
speak,
yes.
was there a particular catalyst event that the idea came to you to create Arck Project? What inspired it?
There was. There were a few moments that were sort of offset in time, but they played off one another. I was sitting in a cafe in Paris, struggling through the print version of Le Monde, if I recall, when I came across a story about ISIS Project. And it was one of the earlier reports of how they were basically doing an either cash and carry or destroying strategy toward cultural heritage. Anything that they couldn't pick up and sell for illicit trafficking on gray and black arts markets, they would blow up. And at that point, the ancient city of Palmyra was being targeted. And the reason I say two parts then for that catalytic moment was because it reminded me of, God, I must have been in my early 20s then, when I remember reading about what the Taliban had perpetrated against the Bamiyan Buddhas in Afghanistan. And of course, obviously, as this interview is being recorded, that's incredibly timely. Once again, the Taliban has just within the last week assumed full control at a staggering speed that apparently nobody foresaw. No comment. And I remembered an extreme sense of helplessness when I had been, as a young man, seeing what was done against the Bamiyan Buddhas, and then seeing something similar happening with ISIS and Syria and Palmyra. And I remember simply rejecting that sense of helplessness, that sense of personal hopelessness. And I also, I will credit that moment with the realization that, look, these artifacts, whether they are monolithic heritage or something much more intimate, say the recognition of the way a section of a city might change from one ethnic or demographic background to another. If we don't track these things, we lose a sense of ourselves. And we lose a sense of both where we come from, yes, but then that makes us more vulnerable to manipulations about ideas of where we are going and who we are. And because I am a former visual effects artist who had very intimate knowledge of certain technologies that are casually used now in visual effects, I realized before I even found out that there were other organizations who had already begun doing things like this, and that in fact, there were techniques that were part of the cultural heritage community to scan heritage in 3D. I realized that this was completely something in my wheelhouse, something that I could engage in. And as I began learning about other organizations that were out there doing it already, I found that there was a badly needed element that was missing, which was democratized activation of people, of citizen scientists, of heritage being recorded at every scale, not just the monolithic, not just the archaeological of arguably dead cultures, but rather living cultures, equally important, at least as important. And I determined that I would do something about it. I just didn't want to feel helpless the way I had back when the Taliban destroyed the Bamiyan Buddhas. I didn't want that feeling again. And in fact, the inaugural project of Arck Project, our very first full-scale project, was a crowdsourced photogrammetric digital recreation, that's a mouthful, I know, of Palmyra. So we, several of my staff of the newly formed organization learned how to search in what I call the shutterbug cultures. The Japanese and German websites, they're tremendous, they're fabulous for being global tourists, shutterbugging everything. And of course, also searching in Arabic and a few other languages, we cobbled together over 13,000 images of Palmyra that had been taken over a span of, I think, 8 years was the largest time period that our earliest to latest photographs accessed. And we were able to generate a photogrammetric recreation of Palmyra that even a scholar at the Metropolitan Museum, a specialist in Near East antiquities, said, and she had been there herself multiple times, said, this is actually the best restoration I've ever seen. And so we took that as our cue that we were doing something right. And then tried to figure out later how that could fit into the cultural heritage community and whether it could. And that's something we're actually still figuring out today.
I so appreciate just not only the natural curiosity and the desire to problem solve, but also knowing that it was not a straight path, and trial and error and learning how to search
Very
in
much so.
German and Arabic. Like, I mean, just the amount of problem solving that you did in order to find a solution that works. I think this leads nicely into my next question, which is, when thinking about Arck Project, launching it, and continuing to do the work you do today, what are the barriers and challenges that you experienced initially, and maybe some that may still continue?
There are significant barriers in what we're doing. There's no question. Initially, I will admit that I was naive going into what we are doing, because as a potential disruptor, of course, that means you're going to ruffle feathers, and we've ruffled quite a few of them. But I was surprised, and initially I was disheartened by the fact that I think a lot of our work was either, sometimes it felt almost as if we had been deliberately misunderstood. There are established professionals and there are established institutions that had been engaging in cultural heritage preservation for longer than I've been alive. And so here we walk in being technologically empowered and maybe with a slight sense of naivete and entitlement, maybe just a little. And we weren't always greeted with the kind of open arms that I had hoped and, as I said, naively expected. And so that was one barrier. But there is also the simple barrier that these technologies that we are using, LiDAR, photogrammetry, citizen science-enabled, consumer-driven reporting technologies, because a lot of what we teach is that with the right training, even a bloody iPhone can be a recorder of heritage. And in the lack of a 100 megapixel Hasselblad, it's so much better to have any archive than none at all, particularly if you have responsible metadata reporting practices, right? So we came at this utilizing technologies that had previously been either unavailable to the masses or strictly used in strict ways by professionals who had been trained lifelong in certain forms of institutionally oriented heritage archiving and heritage preservation and heritage access, which I think is also crucial, right? So it's quite right that some of these technologies should be greeted with suspicion, because with some data, that's a genie out of the bottle moment. Once that data is out in the real world, well, you're never getting that back. And so I've grudgingly acknowledged that some of the suspicion and reticence that these technologies have been greeted with is in fact appropriate. And we've always tried to take the position that while anyone might be engaged in data acquisition, in helping to archive their heritage, that doesn't necessarily mean that that data should itself then be freely accessible to anyone. because these technologies are powerful and data is powerful. And so we've wrestled with that a little bit. We've wrestled with trying to gain the respect and acceptance of established heritage institutions, while at the same time having no problem with walking right into those same conferences, right into those same professional moments and saying, well, we're here, get used to it, and trying to engage them in such a way that they, I think, over time, have grudgingly begun to accept what we do more. And I do credit our organization with being one of those very few that has pushed the envelope in getting a democratized citizen science concept of cultural heritage archiving to be more accepted. And in fact, there are some stodgy organizations that I will not name that have been part of the scene for a long time that have begun sort of altering how they speak about cultural heritage, about how they speak of how it can be archived and where those data sources can originate from. And I don't mind crediting my own organization with being the one to have been part of that.
So I'm going to go off topic for a minute here, Brian, and I hope
Absolutely.
you'll indulge me.
Cool.
I am familiar with Arck Project's work. I have been lucky enough to be able to work with you on some projects, and I know on the back end, the commitment that Arck Project has to the standards in the field, digital preservation standards. I mean, you guys are using cutting edge technology, and you're sometimes helping people write the standards on
Yes.
using those technologies. But then I also want to acknowledge it and share with the larger audience here that Arck Project, compared to some of the other players in the field, places, I think, such a great emphasis in giving agency to the cultures whose heritage you're helping to document. And
Absolutely.
that whole question of who owns digital culture, think that Arck Project's been a leader in that. And I would love to hear your thoughts on that and why you took on that mantle as important for Arck Project to do.
Thank you. Thank you for seeing that, Rachel. I think you've always been gracious about your awareness of what we're trying to do. And, oftentimes that means asking the hard questions, not necessarily having the answers. We hope to have the answers, we hope to evolve them, but we don't claim to. I think the questions that we're asking are at least as important as the answers that will ultimately be derived. And to that end, democratization was crucial because, again, as much as I love monolithic architecture and archaeology, it's a fact that at this point, cultural evolution and cultural change has in fact become far more rapid and often destructive. And you might think that because we are a digital society, a digital civilization, that these things are being archived as part of that because we communicate digitally, but that's not necessarily the case. A tremendous amount of crucial data about how we express ourselves, how we think of ourselves, is in fact considered digital flotsam. It's not being archived because there's simply too much of it, right? So when we began engaging in generating Arck Project and trying to figure out how we should position the organization and where we were needed the most, it became clear that there was no place yet for citizen science in digital archiving. And in fact, it's still considered a little bit of a gray area. But also, it occurred to me that as much as I adore going to a huge institution, a museum or a university collection, these do not represent necessarily the standards and the priorities and the sort of most dearly held tenets of cultures, especially cultures that are impoverished or in states of extremis. And so two things had to happen. One was I felt an extreme need to sort of legitimize our practices, which meant that we studied, we already knew photogrammetry from a visual effects standpoint. Many of my staff members are actually former visual effects artists who, like myself, wanted to turn our craft towards something a little bit more important than Star Wars Episode 1 opening weekend, right? And so we, of course, took those techniques that I think are some of the best in the entire field. But then we wanted to legitimize them by, for example, I made sure that my staff was trained by the absolute best in the academic and archival field of photogrammetry, CHI, Cultural Heritage Imaging in San Francisco. And I adore those people. Even to this day, we credit them all the time with teaching us the very best techniques in photogrammetry. And I think because of where we were coming from, we even taught them a few things. And so there's been a beautiful exchange of knowledge there. But that also meant hiring a professional archivist, full-time staff member, so that he could advise us on archival techniques. That's Michael Conyers. I don't know if you know this. He's the world's most famous archivist, as he calls himself. It's a running joke. I adore it. So that we would be coming from a position of legitimacy. But then it also meant changing things up. And that's where the disruptor part came in, which meant specifically engaging cultures that are in states of extremis. So one of the first examples of that, and actually to this day, the most successful example of that, if we can talk a little bit about the Venezuelan campaign. We used to call it Viva Venezuela. And so we partnered with a fantastic organization called I'm Venezuela that is largely an expat organization, mostly in and around Miami, former Venezuelans who've emigrated. And yet they maintain a really, really healthy volunteer base in Venezuela. And we developed a round-tripping technique and a program by which we trained them on how to shoot for photogrammetry and how to archive the kind of metadata that we need for an authentic archive. And rather than dictate to them, except in one or two specific cases where there were specific artifacts or sites that we knew were either endangered or had been specifically requested from, say, museum curators that they be archived, we allowed our volunteer base themselves to determine what they were interested in recording. And we're so proud of that because we now, at this point, maintain for what we call the Venezuelan people, we maintain for them an archive of over 400, I think we may be close to 500 sites and objects, some of which due to their intrinsic value in materials, bronze, copper, tin, aluminum, steel, have actually been destroyed. Well, because of our volunteer base, because of the techniques that we perfected in training remotely on how to shoot for photogrammetry, while we continue to do most of the software heavy lifting on our side, we have archived these things to such a high degree of technological acuity and fidelity that at some point, when hopefully there was a more stable period in Venezuela, we will round trip that data back to them. And those objects and sites, artifacts, sculptures in some cases that have been destroyed, we will actually be able to repatriate that data back to them. And please understand, it's not the belief that digital heritage replaces in any way the physical heritage. And this has been one of those odd moments when we get these sort of sniping remarks occasionally from heritage organizations or heritage professionals who seem to think that we are trying to supplant what they do when nothing is further from the truth. These are overlapping, mutually beneficial techniques. But the point in what we do is that the digital helps preserve the memory and the symbolism of an object, which then makes it immortal, whereas the physical existence of an object continues its vulnerability. The two together, though, can form an impenetrable shield by which the symbolism and the importance and the cultural memory seeded into an object, whether that's a physical object now or a digital object or both over time, those things remain intact. And that's what we care about. That's what's important. And that's what we're trying to teach. So sorry, I'm not even entirely sure that answers your question, but I get excited about the mission. You know?
You know, as a fellow business owner, and obviously you run your organization, it's, you know, it can be tough, and it's a bit of a hustle sometimes to
It
keep
is.
things going, etc. And so I just want to point out that it is remarkable, I think, and laudable. You know, Arck Project's been around for a while now, and the
Yeah,
fact that you are
we're
still
getting
so
old.
passionate, it's just, I think it's a testament to, like, you're doing what you were meant to do because you still have so much passion, and
Absolutely.
you know, it's just, it is so palatable. So like, I really appreciated that answer, and thank you for letting me sort of go off topic with that question.
No, not at all. Thank you. Can I also mention that, you know, some of this work continues to be very difficult and heartbreaking in the sense that we're trying to reach communities that, in some cases, let's talk about indigenous cultures. Let's talk about Native American, Native Canadian cultures, First Nations peoples, for example. We believe that within certain constraints, a lot of the work we do can be immensely valuable. But when we try to reach out to Native American bands or tribes, look, there is a tremendous culture there, a tremendous history of trauma, of deceit, of betrayal. And we fully recognize that we have a lot of work to do there in understanding, in not preaching to, but rather learning from. And we are absolutely dedicated, regardless of whether we personally do work with these tribes and these entities, that the standards that are developing in the cultural heritage community about how to work with these people is something we absolutely believe we have a clear vision toward. And we want to make sure that as 3D standards and practices and protocols and workflows and industries, sometimes entire fields developing around heritage are developing, that they are done so with Native American voices as part of that, and with their priorities, their standards held far above anyone else's. And we think there's a tremendous amount of work to be done there, but it's also heartbreaking work. There's a lot of distrust. There's and our still young in some ways, organization, you know, has had missteps there too, and we continue to be just absolutely dedicated to the idea that we can be of assistance in this, and you know, but it's a long path, and we absolutely want to make sure that the digital, I call it a cultural gold rush that's taking place in some ways right now in our society, in multiple societies, not run over Native voices this time. And so anyway, just to say there's a lot of work to be done there, and we don't pretend by any means to have all the answers. But again, I will credit us with being one of the few voices who are asking the questions that need to be asked. And we will continue that work.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure.
I know that you shared a bit about the Venezuelan project, and
Yes.
one of my questions was to ask about some of your example partnerships with organizations and cultural communities. Do you have any other projects that you would like to share with us?
Sure. Oh gosh, so many, but given a limited amount of time, what to talk about first? I mean, we're working with a fantastic group of people, Artiv, and the work is sort of behind the scenes with them right now. It's largely about generating more compatible overlapping databases, because there are a lot of different organizations out there that have data which can be immensely important in curtailing illicit trafficking, especially out of the Middle East right now. And I think we're probably about to see a huge influx of illicit trafficking of antiquities from Afghanistan as well, for reasons that should be obvious to everyone right now. And so getting databases to be more open, more compatible, and then once compatibility is established, to then get those databases into the hands of not just import-export authorities, organizations like that, but rather to generate a destruction of plausible deniability, right? So we're talking about auction houses, antique dealers, private collectors. We want to absolutely end plausible deniability in ignorance, that when you are trafficking in an object, you don't know exactly what you're doing, right? So the first step of that, we believe, and Archive has been amazing in working with them so far. We want to generate that overlapping database. But at the same time, it's been a long time with COVID, and we've just been dying to get back in the field. And at long last, I think we have an interim project that we can execute outdoors, which we're very excited about, in Miami. And so a partnership with some of the people who originally were part of I Am Venezuela. Actually, we're working with them to generate a kind of a living map of the murals, which are now this incredible journal of the cultural life of Miami. Miami has become one of those cities that has a world culture, people coming from so many places, especially in the Latin world, of course. And murals are one of the beautiful, beautiful canvases by which this culture is literally painted. But because these canvases are the sides of buildings, the sides of privately owned businesses, there is no framework by which these are necessarily perpetually kept and held dear. And without warning, a given mural can disappear overnight as a new artist paints atop this given incredible public canvas. And so the idea is we'll actually be executing this in the next several months, a volunteer-based campaign. So we'll be training, once again, just like the I Am Venezuela campaign, we will be training people on the ground how to take the photographic and drone-based images, gathering data about the cultural importance of a given mural at a given location, the names of the artists, why they painted it, hopefully even including interviews of those artists. But accepting the fact that these murals are non-permanent, we will be constantly updating this living city map, almost a kind of a living palimpsest of culture, so that through a digital, let's say maybe an iPhone or iPad based app, a mobile app, you'll be able to access at any given moment years of different murals at a given location, so that even though the mural itself may cease to exist, the memory, the cultural importance, and the lineage, because many of these murals actually bounce off one another, right? So you end up with a living memory of culture that is digitally held, but physically dispersed. And so it's both in the physical and in the digital at once. And we just think that's immensely exciting because culture then stacks vertically over time and horizontally over access, and neither destroys the other. I just think it's going to be a fascinating model for heritage preservation that will actually transcend just the format of murals. It's super exciting, and we're using state-of-the-art technology and volunteers and enthusiasts to engage in it. And so it just hits all the buttons of what we care about. And so please stay tuned. I hope you'll have me back actually when we begin executing that project. And also I will mention that we're not private about these things. Whenever we generate a model for interactivity and volunteer activation that works. We want to talk about that model so that other organizations can copy it as well. Be nice if we get a credit here and there, but hey, whatever you can do, whatever you can do. But the idea being that we want these models of heritage preservation to be proselytized.
Yeah, I have to say, and I know you touched on this in some of your answers, the way that Arck Project, how you created it and how you and your team have chosen to conduct yourselves and make those ethical decisions, I think we're now sort of belatedly seeing in the historian and archives fields with
Mhm.
that belated reckoning of the historical record being
Huh.
so incomplete and
Right.
inaccessible to so many. So I think that's all to say that you saw that early on, and the work that you're
Thank you.
doing, the practices you're establishing, are something that both the archives and historian fields could certainly use at this point.
Thank you. We actually like to think of our work as dissolving the boundaries between archives and exhibitions, so that they almost become undefinably together, fused. Um,
Yes, that's my personal opinion. Everything should be together. Yeah,
right.
no silos.
Exactly. No silos. I
Yeah.
love that. I love that. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think my next question for you, I know we've touched on a couple examples of this, but in your own words, I would love to hear you describe the importance and urgency of capturing the digital tapestry of these different cultural heritage sites.
Sure. I do believe there is, on some days, it's almost difficult not to have a sense of panic about how rapidly some cultures are changing, about how little is being done to archive them, particularly on the intimate level. It's um, it's been a source of bitter irony sometimes for me when I see how much academics of ancient, arguably extinct cultures will spend on understanding a piece of garbage from, say, Pompeii, and yet we do so little to archive the personal and the intimate and the small scale and the lowbrow, or simply low finance aspects of human existence now in cultures that, particularly because they are, say, perhaps poverty stricken or in states of political and social extremis, are rapidly evolving. And those stresses that those cultures are going through then generate a level of creativity and adaptability and flexibility that is a real credit to human creativity and human adaptability. And those are the moments that are desperately in need of being archived and of being valued. And yeah, some days it's hard not to have a sense of panic about it. If we had the funding, I'd be sending cameras and recorders everywhere, particularly with languages, right? So due to an involvement with a very good friend of mine, Lena Herzog, and her fantastic work in what's called the Last Whispers projects, I gained a new sort of sensitivity to what's happening with language extinction. And Arck Project can only be spread so thin, but it was interesting to discover through the connections that Lena very graciously made available, some fantastic people, linguistic institute running out of London for a while, I think now out of Berlin. The idea that much language archiving is actually not done with a physical or visual aspect. And yet, if you're talking about archiving a language in, say, a material culture that is very much, say, a sustenance culture, a developing culture, right? The language and the material expression of that culture are so tightly bound. The idea that you would archive the language and the grammar without archiving the material expression of that culture seems insane to me. And so I don't know, that's maybe one of our next disruptor moments, but again, we want to make those tools available, and we've begun working with some in the field linguist archivists to try to help generate a material aspect to how they archive the grammar and vocabulary of languages. And there's so much work to be done. It's just where do you begin? Yes.
Yeah, I can very much imagine and empathize with the feeling of urgency to the point of panic, and yet, I mean, you only have so much time.
Yes.
We have yet to access, at least for daily people, cloning technology for
Right.
yourself. So yeah, I can only imagine it must be very difficult to have to prioritize.
It absolutely is. It's painful, and it's something that we almost refuse to do in the sense that we're simply all about proselytizing the tools. We're actually speaking, I think it's okay to talk about this at a very early stage, an academic model through which various grad student programs in various colleges might work with, say, the parks services to generate a data acquisition model to monitor, especially built heritage out in the field, in parks, in areas that can't always be policed against vandalism, let alone natural wear and tear. We want to generate models by which citizens, volunteers, engaged local heritage organizations, even just children, they can be immensely powerful as data acquisition tools. And those are the models that we are working on so that we won't have to prioritize. And I'll keep you abreast on any successes.
Yes, please do.
Sure.
And related to thinking about Arck Project and the evolution of the projects that you've done, and the partnerships and the standards and tools that you're
Yes.
proselytizing, I would love to hear your perspective on when you were thinking about the process of creating Arck Project and the years since then. Are there some lessons learned that you could share with us, or anything that was surprising to you that came up that, when thinking of fellow innovators, what could be helpful for them?
Oh, so many lessons learned. Yeah, some positive, some negative. Not to take no for an answer is a great one to begin with. Also, the use of tools, the choice of tools. Uh, I recall very, very clearly that when the hurricane that decimated Puerto Rico happened, we found it very difficult to bridge between established heritage professionals, very well-meaning, and the tools that would be on the ground in Puerto Rico at that time to do emergency heritage archiving, because even actually many of the museums and larger cultural institutions in Puerto Rico did survive the hurricane itself structurally, but then without power, in the humidity and heat, many structures became, unfortunately, biohazards due to black mold and things like that, right? And it was shocking. It was a real lesson learned that there was no immediate way to bridge between the tools that established cultural heritage institutions use and a place like Puerto Rico. There was no common bridge whatsoever. And especially as a young organization, which does not have any clearance to be, say, a first responder or a second responder yet, it was immensely frustrating. We think that those are bridges that desperately still need to be built. And we're always open to try to enter into discussions and so on. Another lesson learned is that in order to do what we do at the level that we insist on doing it, we had to accept that unlike what many cultural heritage professionals would prefer, we use commercially available software. We have actually we have zero loyalty to any software package. I will say that. And we migrated from one to the other, and finally settled on, we actually currently use reality capture. I can absolutely attest that it is the best software available for photogrammetry. Now, whether that will continue to be the case, right now we're sort of watching and waiting and listening for clues as to what the new owners of that software package plan on doing with it. And it has been one of the points of criticism and argument between heritage organizations. Should we be using open source software for this? And the lesson that we learned and the philosophy that we developed from that is simply based on actually some of the original philosophies that she helped teach us with, which is the idea that the 3D model that you can access, you can work with, you can directly experience, while incredibly valuable, is not the archive. The archive is the metadata. The archive is the photographic data. Those are mature data collection channels, and that's the archive. That's what matters. The 3D model is simply how you access that archive, right? So that was a lesson learned that freed us up to continue to do the work that we hold dear, and to do it at a rate and a level of fidelity that nobody else can equal. And that will continue to be something that we watch very closely. Maybe a few years from now, open source software will be of such a level of fidelity and speed, because sorry, but speed does matter in this case, because there's so much to be done, and the ability to round trip to a given volunteer in a remote location what is missing, what is incorrect or insufficient or incorrectly done for a given 3D archive. That ability to rapidly round trip is crucial in developing volunteer techniques. So who knows, maybe in a few years open source software will be the way to go, but right now we continue to proselytize that commercially available software is the way to go. And in fact, that particular software package may in fact become free as part of the new owners, Epic Games, and what they want to do with it. We would love to hear from them some pronouncement about their commitment to cultural heritage functions for that software, and it's rightful that it might make some heritage professionals and heritage institutions nervous. The proximity between the software that archives the heritage and the software that puts it in a game. And so that's a dangerous moment. And so the lesson learned there is simply to be vigilant and to keep watch. But I think we've also learned that there are so many overlapping organizations and interests out there that you can't spend too much effort, you can't spend too much time building bridges with other organizations. Because at one point I became impatient, I'll admit it, with cultural heritage gatekeepers who seemed more interested in deliberately misunderstanding and taking issue with the digital as if the digital were trying to replace the physical. I became really, really impatient with philosophies like that, and with knee-jerk, frankly, silly responses like that. And we had work to do. And I just said, you know what, enough, we're busy. I don't need your approval, and I don't want it anymore, right? So I think it's time to start trying to, okay, come around, come full circle, and let's see if now we can speak a little bit less shrilly than before about these issues, and build bridges so that we can keep everybody responsible and accountable and absolutely cutting edge.
I would love to hear from you. Why are archives important, in your own words?
Archives are important because, regardless of how accessible they are, and access is important, I think it's crucial. It's the memory of who we were. And I do not believe that if you forget who you were, that you can responsibly and accountably and safely plot who you want to become. I look at what's happening in Venezuela right now, and I look at how cultural memory is being erased, not because of, say, religious extremism, as will probably happen and has been happening in parts of the Middle East with the Wahhabist takeover of Islam, with the extremists created by civil war in Syria, and now the Taliban consumption of Afghanistan, and what's about to happen with Sharia law. But it doesn't have to be anything so deliberate. It can be simply the forces of modernity or economy, international finances. When I look at what's happening in Venezuela, and I look at sculptures being cut up overnight, statues, like monolithic scale statues being vivisected, a piece at a time over a week and melted down for their constituent metals. I don't just see it as a loss of history, I see it as a loss of direction. And when I look at Venezuela, I think about Chinese development loans and American oil companies and international fast foods and all the things that will seed themselves and redirect Venezuelan culture the moment that they have that capability. And that, I think, is what we're fighting against. And that's why archives, and especially making archives, not just having them, but making them more accessible, making them more vivid and engaging. That's not just entertainment. That's getting them into the hearts and minds of people so that they maintain a sense of themselves that can be resistant, that is sufficient to resist the forces of fast foods and quick, easy loans and American oil interests, right? That's why that's so crucial. If you forget who you were, I don't think you have a chance of deciding who you will become. And that's what we're all about. That's what heritage preservation has to be about, as well as its purely scientific validity. It has to be strong enough to carry both missions at once, I believe.
I have just one last question on my part, Ryan, and that's what's next for Arck Project?
Oh, wow. Okay, so what is next for Arck Project? So many things, so many irons in the fire at any given moment. I did describe the Miami project, the murals archiving project, so that's in our immediate future. We're also looking at engaging in some software development applications. It has long occurred to me that I don't know if you're familiar with sort of distributed computational platforms, like the way I pronounce it is simply BOINC, B-O-I-N-C. It's a globalized distributed processing framework by which the average computer user can donate spare processor cycles to very worthy projects like SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, which spent decades analyzing radio data from Arecibo and other radio antennas, as well as more modern functions, very much present functions like folding proteins, pharmaceutical design, weather modeling, etc. I would love to see Arck's efforts go toward a distributed software processing platform that would allow all of the world's spare processor cycles be engaged in computing 3D solves for endangered heritage. So that's something we're always looking at. One other thing that I'm really excited about, we just inaugurated an advisors council within Arck Project, and two of the first gentlemen to join our advisory council are gentlemen who've been involved in cultural heritage scanning for decades, actually. And one of them was even involved in developing the techniques by which the Dead Sea Scrolls were scanned and sort of unfolded digitally. And we're incredibly proud to have Eric Dean and Greg Behrman on our advisory council as we, again, try to sort of deepen our scientific roots, even as we become more and more unorthodox about how we engage volunteers. So that's happening at both ends. We're very, very excited about that. And in fact, they are helping us design a program by which we will engage various colleges and graduate programs with using volunteer accessed data from the field to do cultural heritage archiving and translation programs.
So just a couple projects.
Yeah, just a few things here and there. Yes. Like, and while still trying to figure out how to fund ourselves. By the way, right now we continue to be entirely privately funded. We have gotten a few small grants. We're continuing to reach out into the granting world, but we're also doing that with a certain amount of skepticism. We've been well trained by granting professionals. You yourself, actually, early on in our organization's genesis, helped us learn how to navigate the kind of landmine, the minefield of what's out there, so that one can access grants, but one has to be careful not to allow one's mission to be decentralized or deterred. Because grants, while a beautiful source of funding, can also eat your organization if you're not careful, right? So we continue to hold granting at somewhat arm's length. We're hoping over time that we'll develop that as a better arm for funding the organization. But we've also not wanted to have too many external influences when it comes to granting. And we've been lucky in that we've had a few private donors who've been extremely generous, that have allowed us to plot our path without having to owe too much to worry about where that money came from. So we've continued to be self-directing and self-empowering in that. And I'm incredibly grateful for that.
Well, Brian, is there anything that I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that you would like to share with us before I let you go?
I would just like to share that I think there is a genesis happening. There's something new happening in awareness of what we do. I think it's an exciting time that we don't actually have to spend 20 minutes now explaining to the average layperson the technology that's behind us. That itself has been amazingly liberating, making this a really, really exciting time to see how the culture and the technology are intertwining to make our job easier and easier in some ways. And I will also say that thanks to people like you and thanks to organizations like SAA, we are finding it easier to get the word out there. We don't have to fight so hard to have a sense of legitimacy in what we're doing. And I absolutely credit you and the archival organization in part of that. It's getting easier and easier to sell what we do. And now we don't have to worry so much about basic arguments of legitimacy. Now we can start working on creating synergy and creating ethics and protocols by which everyone should be abiding. To really, really make something stellar happen with the fusion of these technologies and these interests over the next 5 or 10 years. I think it's going to be a super exciting time, and we have people and organizations like yours to thank for that.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. I really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
your time and you sharing so much about Arck Project with us. We'll go ahead and conclude the formal recording of this interview.
Very well. Thank you so much for having us.